Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in downtown Washington, D.C., one of the world's leading think tanks, at the unveiling of the fourth report since 2002, co-chaired by former Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage and Harvard professor Joe Nye, talking about the future of the U.S. Japan relationship as well as challenges in Asia. And one of the participants in that study is Dr. Zack Cooper, formerly of CSIS, now of the American Enterprise Institute. More important than ever, renewing the U.S. Japan alliance for the 21st century. All kinds of all-stars, Zack, on this team, from Victor Cha to Mike Green of CSIS, Matt Goodman as well as you've got, Kara on that, as well as Kevin Nealer and Sheila Smith. Absolutely all-star. You focused on the military side of that equation. Talk to us a little bit about the core. You focused on, we covered the gamut from economic challenges to the broad strategic challenges. You focused on the military challenges and what the U.S.-Japan military alliance needs to do to gear up for the challenge of a far more assertive China. Talk to us about the really kind of breakthrough recommendations you guys are making here.
Well, thanks so much. We're glad that people are interested in the report. What we've tried to do is really talk about the importance of operational coordination between the two countries. We all know that the challenge from China is growing. It's just increasingly important for both the U.S. and Japan to be able to work closely together, not just on East China Sea issues, but also farther afield. We've seen Japan, in fact, going as far as having a ship docked in Sri Lanka just the last few weeks. And so whether it's the Indian Ocean or the South China Sea, we really need greater operational coordination between the United States and Japan. So we put together about 5 or 6 recommendations that are pointing in that direction. I'd say the most important to my mind are making organizational challenges in the two governments. So in Japan, we've suggested that Japan should create a joint operations command. The best example of this is the one in Australia, which was stood up a few years ago, and it's really made a huge difference in Australia's ability to deal with challenges, not just near Australia, but actually at great distances. And the ability for Australia to operate quickly and for commanders to quickly give orders across components has been really a important thing for their jointness. And jointness has always been a problem in Japan, so we're hoping that that would help. And that's something that's already being talked about in Tokyo. Another initiative on the U.S. side, which is complementary, is to actually look at the U.S. command structures, especially in the Indo-Pacific Command. And there what we've suggested is that the United States should set up a combined joint task force focused on the Western Pacific, mainly to deal with China contingencies. And we would hope that Japan could have some officers, potentially as liaison officers, as part of that standing combined joint task force, but basically to take pressure off the Indo-PACOM commander to do the liaising with Washington and the commanding of all the different components, give that to a standing joint task force who's better able to handle those operational duties.
And you also mentioned co-basing, right? That too often U.S. and Japanese forces, even within Japan, are too segregated and should be integrated.
That's right. So there are places, especially on the Japanese main islands, where we've got joint basing. So places like Misawa and Iwakuni, joint bases, a lot of cooperation. But if you get into the southwestern islands, places like Okinawa, actually, even though we have very few bases in Okinawa, they're all separate. And so part of what we're looking at is trying to make them more joint and combined. One real challenge in Okinawa, for example, is that, yes, you've got Marines at one location, the Navy and others, Air Force at others. It's difficult even across the U.S. military to use those bases, and the Japanese have the same problem on their side. So one way to increase the reliability of the forces and the sustainability of the forces is to use those bases together, both U.S. and Japan together, but also across services over time. And that's a long-term recommendation. A lot of cultural changes, organizational changes would need to be made, but we think it's important that over time we work towards that end state.
Which would get difficult given that there's a new governor in Okinawa Prefecture, right, who's a biracial American Marine father and an Okinawan mother who's even more strident than his predecessors were about the future of U.S. troops on Okinawa.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I would say first, the Americans that were part of the Armitage and I report, we have suggested that Japan is going to have to sort out the prefectural government and the federal government, how it wants to handle that issue. But I think the U.S. role is to continue to play the strong supporting role in trying to move U.S. forces up to Hanoko, where they're more out of the way of the local populace. That will decrease the impact on the local population over time. And I think one thing we have to remember is the Okinawan population relies a lot on the kind of support they get both from the Japanese government and from the presence of U.S. military forces for their economic status. And so there is an important economic driver, and part of moving towards joint bases is both to be able to maximize our combat effectiveness, but also to minimize the impact on the local community.
Let's talk about weapons modernization priorities, which you have a list of, but as well intelligence sharing, which you guys are recommending something truly breakthrough in allowing Japan to join what is the world's most successful intelligence sharing arrangement.
Right. Well, we often talk about Five Eyes, basically the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada working together on intelligence issues. We think over time we should move towards Japan being included in that. That would essentially make it Six Eyes. I don't think this is going to happen overnight. No one does. Japan has made a lot of progress recently on secrecy laws, for example, but there's a lot more work to be done on the protection of classified information, the sharing of information, et cetera, et cetera. But let's start doing that work now. As we say in the report, Japan is the most important U.S. ally and the most important part of the world. It doesn't make sense for Japan not to be in the premier intelligence sharing alignment around the world. They've got to be inside it at some point. So let's do the work now to get towards that.
And about modernization, you guys had a wide range of mutual modernization needs that should be done as much as possible as an alliance as opposed to just an acquisition relationship.
That's right. So one example that we've seen that I think was very effective of joint development was the U.S. and Japan working together on SM-3 Block 2A. And so we'd like to see more of that type of cooperation, systems that both countries need, that provide value for both countries and decrease cost, right? That's what everybody wants. So we've got to move towards that. And it turns out that there are a lot of areas where the United States and Japan not only have similar capability requirements, but in some cases have capability requirements that are far different from other countries, right? A lot of high-end forces that the United States is procuring, Japan is one of the only countries that is actually capable of operating those forces as well. So on everything from missile defense to anti-ship missiles to undersea submersibles, battery technology, amphibious vehicles, there are requirements on both in Washington and in Tokyo for similar systems. Let's try and save money, get the best equipment we can by co-producing and co-developing those systems.
Let me ask you about tone. That was something that Rich Armitage noted, that we should not talk about talk about China as an adversary as such. It's a security challenge. The last administration tried very, very hard to, hey, let's prepare for something, but let's not start talking about China as an adversary. This administration has opened up the throttles on it. There is a proxy confrontation on the trade side of things where she feels we're in a great power competition. We're not going to yield anymore. President Trump has said we're not going to yield. So two immovable objects hitting each other is not a good thing. But talk to us about the importance of tone, because Secretary Armitage did make a very nuanced point of there's a lot to, and so did Joe Nye. It's Professor Nye. It's very, very important for us to have the right tone. Talk to us a little bit about that, because everybody across the piece was talking about that. Be precise in what we're saying regarding both problems, potential solutions, and concern.
That's right. So I think across the group, our view is China is no doubt a competitor. We have to acknowledge that they're a competitor in a whole variety of domains, everything from the security area to the economic, and even on regional order and international order, we're seeing competition. So that's fine. We've dealt with competition before. That's actually what democracy is all about: competition of ideas, right? That's what our capitalist system is about: competition in the economic realm. We shouldn't be worried about competition. I think where we really should be worried is about where that turns into conflict. So we want to do things that minimize the likelihood of conflict. And I think the overarching theme of the report is that how do you deter and prevent conflict? Well, one way in the region is to make sure that U.S. alliances are strong, right? Don't provide any wiggle room so that if China, for example, pushes on alliance, it encounters weakness, right? We want to make sure that U.S. alliances are strong, and that's just a strong way of competing. And hopefully we can shape China's choices to prevent it from becoming an adversary over time. I think that's what we all hope to see. But I think increasingly we have to be realistic that that may not be the direction that the engagement is going to go. And if that's the case, we have to prepare for it. And the diplomats are going to have their job trying to avoid that type of direction in the relationship. But meanwhile, the military folks, we've got to be ready for the downside risk, and the downside risk is a potential contingency. And so what we try to do is focus on the warfighting capabilities, the deterrence capabilities, but we do think that there has to be continued engagement with China where it's possible for us to cooperate.
Let me ask you one last question. It was great also to hear from Rich Armitage, somebody who's intimately familiar with the region, making clear that, look, she is powerful, China's powerful, but it's also a brittle country in a lot of ways, and certainly cannot go up to a combined, when the first and the third most powerful economies in the world, there's a whole bunch of reasons for things not to erupt in conflict, but there's a challenge, and the challenge is, we've seen, even in the last couple of days, USS Decatur got into a very close call situation. It was on a freedom of navigation operation on one of the contested, or next to one of the contested Chinese islands. China's becoming increasingly aggressive. This one, I think, ranks as one of the more aggressive things, where the ships came within yards of one another. The video, it's a big ocean, and having two ships that close to one another is not good. What's the right way for the international community to deal with this? There is a consensus view the last administration wasn't strong enough to do that. When you ask folks in the last administration, they said, what did you expect us to do if China is doing this kind of an extraordinary thing? Very few organizations have followed this as closely as you guys have at CSIS, casting sunshine on it through regular release of all sorts of spatial imaging to sort of demonstrate and to call the Chinese out as part of a transparency initiative. Talk to us a little bit about what could have been done, what's the way ahead here on how the United States and its allies can assert its freedom of navigation, while at the same time the Chinese are really trying to make good on their threats that the South China Sea is our sea, and we now have the means to enforce air defense identification zones or anything else.
Yeah, look, the South China Sea is a hard problem. I think the reality is that China has built 7 features in the Spratlys, and they're not going to go away anytime soon. And we're going to have to accept that as a reality. It doesn't mean that we think that they get the same legal rights as an actual island would. It doesn't mean that we have to acknowledge the 9-dash line as legally viable. It's not. But we have to accept the reality that the islands are there. They're going to be militarized more than they actually have been already, and that's going to happen. I think one step in a response is to show that that won't change how we operate. That's why freedom of navigation operations are so critical. My view is that the Chinese are likely to continue challenging those operations. The challenges may get tougher. I actually would say the challenge to the Decatur is maybe slightly less bad than what we've seen in a couple of similar incidents. If you go back to 2009, the USNS Impeccable was challenged in not just by a PLA Navy ship, but by a combination of PLA Navy and Coast Guard and some fishing fleet ships that were clearly directed from Beijing. And that was maybe even a more serious challenge. But look, the Chinese are going to try and increase the pressure and see whether the U.S. is willing to keep going. My view is that in this incident, in the type of unsafe incident at sea, what we're really seeing is a limited probe. So the Chinese will probe. If it works, great. They'll take the gain. If it doesn't, they'll stop. There won't be any more pressure of that kind, at least in the near term. So the U.S. job then is to just show that it won't change its actions if there's a limited probe. That's fine. We can continue operating, but certainly we should call out Chinese behavior. I'd love to see a video of the Chinese behavior actually released online. Anything to show that China is taking risky actions here that are unnecessary. Now, I don't want to suggest that that in any way is going to solve the problem of China having 7 features in the Spratlys that are fully militarized. It won't. FONOPs are a piece of the solution. I think we're going to need a longer-term strategy to work with the region to figure out how to deal both from a military angle and from a political angle with the reality in the South China Sea, which is very different now than it was just 5 years ago.
Zack Cooper, PhD from the American Enterprise Institute and one of the participants in this extraordinary study, more important than ever, renewing the U.S. Japan alliance for the 21st century, the fourth in the series that Rich Armitage and Joe Nye have worked on since 2002. Zack, thanks very much. Look forward to having you back on again soon.
Thanks so much, Vago.